The Jerry Powell podcast is brought to you by Archstone Foundation, improving the health and well-being of older Californians and their caregivers.
Welcome to the Jerry Powell podcast. This is Eric Widera.
This is Alex Smith.
And Alex, who do we have with us today?
Today we have some far-flung guests. We have Marco Canevelli, who is a neurologist and research associate at the Sapienza University in Rome, Italy, joining us. Welcome to the Jerry Powell podcast, Marco.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
And we have Tim Anderson, who is a general interest. He's generally interesting. He's a general internist and researcher in the Division of General Medicine at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and Harvard Med School. Welcome to the Jerry Powell podcast, Tim.
Thanks for having me, Alex and Eric.
And we're going to be talking about two articles that just got published not too long ago. Tim's article in JAMA, was it JAMA IM, I believe, on the representativeness of participants enrolled in clinical trials on aducanumab, my favorite topic, and also Marco's article on real-world eligibility for aducanumab, basically looking at the two trials for aducanumab. Do the populations studied look like the populations that we're potentially going to give this drug to? We're going to talk a lot about other things as well, but before we do you have a topic? Or not a topic. We have a topic. Do you have a song?
Song just said the topic.
I'm used to noon podcasts. This is an 8 a.m.
It's early for us. We had to start really early so we could do this with Marco in Italy.
And it wasn't it was JAMA, right, Tim?
It was JAMA.
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 Do you got a song request for Alex?
I do. I was hoping to hear. I can see clearly now. We're talking about a drug for which there's been a lot of clouding and a lot of shadowing, and I think both Marco and I have been interested in trying to see more clearly about aducanumab, and that's the inspiration for this song request.
Nice link. I'll also mention that Tim actually had some even better song requests that I couldn't quite pull off in the time that we had. Tim, you want to just say what those other requests were?
So my first choice was All About the Benjamins. I think also apropos for the topic, though I realize hip hop may not be quite so well suited for your acoustic guitar.
That would have been a good one. All right. Well, here's a little bit of I Can See Clearly Now. I can see clearly now the rain is gone. I can see all obstacles in my way. Gone are the dark clouds that made me blind. It's gonna be a bright, sunshiny day. It's gonna be a bright, sunshiny day. So optimistic.
Wow.
Tim, is that why you picked this song? Because aducanumab or Aduhelm is such an effective drug that it's giving hope for a cure for Alzheimer's disease?
I'll bite my tongue at the answer to that one. But, I think it's, if nothing else, worth celebrating the optimism of folks paying close attention to drug approvals. As we are not the first guests on the Jerry Powell podcast, I think, to be talking about aducanumab. So I'll be optimistic on transparency through Jerry Powell.
Well, since Tim mentioned it, for all the guests, we're going to be talking about aducanumab. And for all of our listeners, we've had two podcasts on it already. One with Gil Rabinovich on amyloid, all things amyloid, including amyloid, aducanumab and amyloid PET scans. That was from April. And another one with Aaron Kesselheim and Jason Karlowich on the approval process and what aducanumab is. What went wrong with the approval process. And that was from July 29th of this year. And today we're going to talk about, now what does it look like in real world practice? And that's why I love these two articles in JAGS and JAMA. Marco, can I turn to you first? First of all, how are things going in Rome right now in Italy with COVID?
Yeah. Fortunately, are definitely better than some months ago and last year, especially. So, Rome wasn't. Things in Rome were relatively better than the rest of the country since the beginning of the pandemic, fortunately. But now there is a very high vaccination rate, so things are definitely better. So thanks.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Happy to hear that.
Yeah, also, patients attending our outpatient services are now increasing in number. So also the dementia care and support is now definitely more closer to our standards before the pandemic.
Yeah.
So,
And what does your clinical practice look like?
yeah, I work in a outpatient memory clinic. In Italy, we call memory clinics a center for dementias and cognitive disorders. And I spend most of my clinical activities with patients and with mild cognitive impairment and dementia. Yeah.
So is that how you got interested in looking at the real world eligibility for aducanumab?
Yeah, I was always been attracted by this enormous gap between the populations that are enrolled in clinical trials, in research protocols, and the patients that I daily encounter in my daily practice. So, and it's something that I had already addressed with some geriatric colleagues. I work a lot with geriatricians and less with neurologists. I am a typical neurologist, I think. And so we explored, for example, the reporting of important variables in research protocols, such as age, sex, comorbidities, or concomitant treatments that are something that represent the main part of my daily activities. And this information is almost completely missing in the research reports from clinical trials. And this may generate what is known as the evidence-based medicine issue in the care for the people. So we treat with drugs and intervention people that are completely different from those that were enrolled in research protocols. So this is an enormous problem to me.
And how about you, Tim? How'd you get interested in this as a subject?
So I'm a primary care doc when not playing around with large data sets. And amongst almost all new drugs, if there ends up being a commercial on it, sooner or later, it's a conversation that I have with one patient or another. And aducanumab felt like one of these things that was getting so much news coverage that trying to understand even those early questions that I'm likely to get for patients, and often it's healthy folks who do not have dementia who are just saying, sometimes I forget a name. Should I be on this drug? Is almost how people enter into primary care. I will say that similar to Marco, this question about the gap between who is studied and who gets a medicine is something that probably predates my interest in aducanumab. It's something I've had the fortune to study when it comes to the use of things like antihypertensives in older adults and other disease states. And often finding that trials aren't entirely representative of our patients, but that not all trials are the same. There may be very, very different reasons that certain trials exclude certain folks compared to others. And so it's kind of a growing topic of fascination, both to reflect how we talk to patients, but also, sometimes how we train our students and our residents and the folks who are with us in the clinic.
Okay, maybe we can step back. Like, why are trials not representative? Like, what are the reasons that when you create these studies that you may create a study that is not representative of the patient population that you actually are hoping it to give it to?
You mean from the drug company's perspective?
I think from the general perspective, maybe we can list some potential reasons.
I think that this is somehow reasonable from the point of view of the companies. For example, Alzheimer's disease is extremely heterogeneous in terms of biological mechanisms, in terms of cognitive trajectories over time. So you need to apply some strict criteria to homogenize the samples. It's something that I may understand, of course. For example, you need to identify those patients that have amyloid burden at the PET scan or who have a specific cognitive profile. Otherwise, it's difficult to recruit an homogeneous population.
Great. So if you have a drug that takes away amyloid, you should probably be focused on those with amyloid in the brain. Important thing that the FDA left out early on, I think, in their labeling. They should probably read the study a little closer. So great. So like if you're going to give a drug for acute coronary syndrome, you should probably include just those people with acute coronary syndrome. If you're going to give a drug that takes away amyloid, focus on amyloid. What are some other reasons?
I think another big one that is understandable and common are these large safety risks. So if we know a drug might promote bleeding or might promote something along those lines in an explanatory trial, you might not want to include people who have conditions or take medicines really prone to bleeding, which is, I think, relevant to aducanumab. That also, though, I think becomes important if the drugs we're talking about are ones that are used by a large amount of the population. It's one thing, I think, if you're excluding, a drug 1% of people take, and another thing when we're talking about medicines that 20 or 30% of older adults take.
Great. And I'm gonna put my Ken Kavinsky cap on. Age. I often see age as a factor to exclude people from trials. I think Emerge and Engage, the two trials for aducanumab, excluded people who were older than age 85. Why exclude older adults? It seems like that's a population that may get this drug.
I don't have the explanation for you. Of course, almost all trials adopt upper age limits. So this is not just Emerge and Engage. And while we encounter a lot of patients aged more than 85 years in our daily practice. So it's, of course, there is the burden of comorbidities. There are also some more difficulties at reaching the clinical site or the research site for taking the intervention, but we have to include older people, the oldest old, also to have real evidence-based medicine interventions.
Yeah, I think that perhaps there are certain diseases where certain age ranges make sense because of competing risks of other causes of morbidity and mortality. But in this case, particularly, when studying dementia or when studying any disease that is particularly prevalent amongst older adults, putting an old age cap makes little scientific sense that I can rationale. I can kind of see, I think they also put a minimum age of 50 cap, which made a little more sense in that if you have dementia under age 50, it may not be Alzheimer's or maybe kind of a specific variant, but I can't think of a good reason to say that a 85-year-old is different than an 84-year-old with dementia.
So it sounds like there are some reasonable scientific reasons that to have good inclusion exclusion criteria, and there are some that maybe don't make a whole lot of sense, and some that you're potentially using to really show a benefit and minimize harms. What does it look like then when it gets transferred to the real world? Tim, I'm going to start off with your article in JAMA, research letter, September 9th. And what did you do?
So we tried to take a pretty simple approach of asking the question of, amongst patients with Medicare in the United States, which is most older adults, how often do the patients who have a diagnosis of dementia or of mild cognitive impairment have one or more of the different exclusion criteria from the two trials for aducanumab? And we did this using insurance claims, which is not perfect, but is not a bad estimate in that, to know that you meet an exclusion criteria, a doctor must have diagnosed you with that criteria. And so we looked at all the different criteria that the companies had posted as their exclusion criteria publicly and applied those to about 3 million or so Medicare beneficiaries who had a diagnosis of dementia in the US in 2018, finding that only about 10% would have met trial inclusion criteria with the remaining 90% meeting one, but in most cases more like 2, 3, and sometimes 4 or more different exclusion criteria, including some of the things we talked about, like being over 85, but perhaps I think most commonly having other comorbidities or being on medications that would have excluded them out from being in the aducanumab trials.
That's a lot. So 9 out of 10 would be excluded from these trials. What were the big exclusion reasons again?
So the biggest ones we found, one was pre-existing heart disease or cardiovascular disease, which is a challenging one because obviously that's a very common syndrome in old age, and also there's a lot of links between dementia and cardiovascular disease. So it's a tricky one. The other ones we found were chronic kidney disease and having conditions for which people usually get blood thinners. So conditions like atrial fibrillation or history of blood clots, or certain types of heart problems for which people are on blood thinners regularly.
And in the trial, Emerge and Engage, so those are the two trials looking at aducanumab. They excluded folks who were on anticoagulation, so medications like warfarin, or strong antiplatelet agents. Is that right?
Correct. The way it's at least publicly written on the clinical trials websites is if you were on a full dose aspirin, then that would be an exclusion criteria. Baby aspirin was allowed, but anything stronger than that.
What are the practical implications of your findings?
Well, I think the reason we were so focused on Medicare specifically is Medicare is now in a decision in the United States of deciding what the confines of paying for this medicine are. They're likely to be the big payer who decides whether this is worth the investment. And the FDA, who approved the drug in the United States, put no limits related to these exclusion criteria. They approved them for anyone with cognitive impairment or mild dementia. And so we hope that both clinicians will read these findings, but also that honestly Medicare will think about these findings when they decide what are the bounds of what they're will feel comfortable to pay for aducanumab. What are those clinical scenarios? And there is a history of Medicare occasionally requiring either additional evidence to be generated for them to cover drugs fully, or requiring that the only time they'll pay for the drug is if folks are enrolled in certain sort of studies, so that if we are going to give the drugs to people who were not in these trials, we're at least getting data to understand if that's helpful or hurtful, rather than just kind of doing it blindly.
All right. So what I'm reading about aducanumab right now is that it really should be prescribed by folks who have expertise in dementia, neurologists, geriatricians, and the like, potentially specific centers. So, Tim, your article is great, but maybe like real world application, we have to look at the eligibility of these drugs in those specific centers. Marco, is that what you did?
Yeah, and that is even lower than what estimated by Tim. I read with great interest the paper on JAMA by Tim, and congratulations on this. And we had a similar idea, I think, that was to apply the eligibility criteria that were adopted in the Emerge and Engage trials on a clinical population. And so we considered a representative sample of patients that were almost 900 patients referred to a geriatric outpatient unit in a university hospital in Milan with my friend and colleague Matteo Cesari. All these patients had a cognitive complaint. And so we sequentially applied all the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So the age limits, the education, the need for a formal caregiver, paying attention to the patient, the clinical condition of MCI or mild AD, with the mini mental state score examination no lower than 24. So all the eligibility criteria. And so we found that just 6 patients out of the 911 that were considered at the beginning resulted as potentially eligible to receive aducanumab if these eligibility criteria were applied. So there was less than 1% of the overall population. And most of patients were excluded because of the age limit, because of the low educational level, because they were living alone. So they didn't have a caregiver, because of comorbidities, because they had known Alzheimer's disease dementias, or Alzheimer's disease dementia of higher severity. So we created a flowchart where at each step, a lot of patients were excluded. So we remained with just 6 patients. That was, and what I think that was even more, I say dangerous, I don't know, it's the gap between the number of eligible patients that would be obtained if the FDA indication are applied to this population, because the number is definitely higher. The FDA doesn't explicitly include some exclusion criteria for age or comorbidities, or even for the PET scan, of course. So the number of eligible patients becomes extremely higher. It's nearly 35%. So there is a gap between 1% and 35% that may be dangerous in the clinical practice.
I kind of want to ask, what the hell, FDA? But like, why is it still the label for aducanumab? Given both of your studies, these huge exclusion criteria, why is the label so broad?
It's hard to express my opinion on this, or it's extremely easy. But I am also surprised by the fact that the amyloid PET is not mentioned, while it is one of the main entry criteria in the trials. And also there is a conditional verb. Of course, I'm Italian. I'm not a native English speaking, but there is that should be used in MCI patients and mild AD patients. So theoretically, I can use this drug even in patients with a more severe cognitive and functional impairment. So there is a huge gap between the registration trials and the indications.
Yeah.
And I'll just add that I guess I'm a little surprised that the FDA, or to be honest, the manufacturer hasn't thought about requesting a change in their labeling, which is what happened in the initial labeling, that it was not limited to folks with mild disease, but initially labeled for everyone. And in part, after a lot of public discussion, it felt they changed that label down to the trial studied in terms of inclusion population. I think I wouldn't expect, the age limits and things to end up being making it into the FDA, but certain, especially safety concerns about, other conditions, and those pieces just feel like something that naturally is often in FDA labeling when it comes to other new drugs. Certainly something we see with new cancer drugs, new heart drugs, where, chronic kidney disease and things like that are all the time in the FDA label as, at a minimum, use with caution, at a maximum, don't use until we have further research. So I think it's kind of a drastic change in labeling compared to other new therapeutics.
Which is interesting, like ARIA-H. So the big side effect that we see with aducanumab is ARIA, and specifically, basically, micro brain bleeds. And my understanding is that based on previous trials of anti-amyloid antibodies, found out that potentially is a safety signal with anticoagulants, and new studies are excluding patients specifically who are on anticoagulants, antithrombotics. Why not include that? Since we have data that, hey, there is a safety concern, we're going to exclude these patients from the trials. Why not include that as a contraindication? Either of you.
I don't know how FDA makes these decisions. I mean, there's so many decisions that we could question from approval of aducanumab on. Yeah, it's a good question, but I don't know that we know what they're thinking.
No, maybe there is the need or the ambition of targeting all the entire AD population, and so they don't explicitly mention exclusion or inclusion criteria, but I don't know.
Marco, you are in Italy, of course, in Rome, and Italy is not beholden to whatever the FDA says or does. So, do you have your own FDA equivalent there? And what is the approval process like there?
Yeah, so since I think November 2020, aducanumab is also under review at the EMA, is the European Medicine Agency, following a standard procedure. So aducanumab is not under accelerated approval procedure like in the US for the FDA. And usually there is a very high concordance between these entities, FDA and the EMA. So the majority of drugs that are approved by the FDA at the end are also approved by the EMA. But there are some differences in the validation of surrogate or intermediate endpoints. And also the two assessments are conducted at different times of so there are also other evidence that may be provided by the manufacturer, by Gen in this case. And so we are extremely curious about this, because then EMA should approve the drug, and then there is also an Italian agency for the drug that should assess this.
Right. And they could come up with their own exclusion criteria, which they could mirror the FDA, which is very generous exclusion criteria, or they could mirror what they did in the original studies in Engage and Emerge.
Yeah. They could has to replicate somehow the eligibility criteria that were adopted in the registration trials, of course. Yeah.
And Tim and Eric, I'm not sure if you're following the CMS process. My understanding is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, who will decide on whether to approve aducanumab for under Part B, right, of Medicare prescribing, because it's an infusion and not like a pill that you'd have under Part D. They won't make a decision until sometime early in 2022, is what I heard. Have you heard anything different?
That's my understanding as well. And I know there's been an open comment period that I believe is still open this month, though it may be closing, in which colleagues have submitted essentially requests for this exact consideration, as well as, I think there's a request from all interested parties, from patient groups to sponsors. And so it's certainly an area that folks who feel passionately about this can directly comment to the FDA, and the idea of their process is that they're trying to take in all of those stakeholder groups to make a coverage determination. And I think some of the most interesting literature out there comes from policy wonks in journals like Health Affairs, talking about all the creative ways FDA could kind of approve aducanumab payment, the CMS could kind of approve aducanumab either in only certain populations or only with certain strings attached. And so my hope is that if it is covered, it'll be covered with kind of an eye towards generating data sooner than the 10-year window that the FDA asked for additional data from the manufacturer.
Yeah.
And I guess the one caveat too is I'm pretty sure Medicaid will actually need to cover that, because they have to cover all FDA approved drugs. So that may be a separate process. Tim, do you know anything about that?
I will fess to not being a very wise expert when it comes to Medicaid coverage. I think you're right in terms of there being a direct requirement about coverage of approval, but I don't know whether there's ways for that to be limited in certain forms. I think the challenge there is Medicaid, at a state level, has a fixed budget. So if they have to cover it and there's a lot of demand, that can mean they have to cut what they'll cover in other fields of medicine.
Yeah. It's good that they have to make that choice on a drug that, if it works barely at all. Still big if.
And Tim, you mentioned that there's an open comment period to CMS, and I just want to note that the American Geriatric Society wrote a terrific letter. Eric, I think you may have been involved in this. Is that right? The drafting of that letter?
Minimally,
but to some extent. And one point that they bring up in their letter, which we'll include a link to it in the show notes to this podcast, is the really the lack of representativeness by race and ethnicity in the Engage and Emerge trials. And we've talked about this a little bit on our prior podcast. What did they have? Something like six? I'm seeing Eric nod. 6 Black participants.
So in the high dose Emerge study, so the only group that showed a difference, there were 6 Black participants who identified as Black in that study. So really all of this for, I think it's one of the biggest issues right now in dementia research is issues about representativeness, not just on inclusion exclusion criteria, but the diversity of subjects.
Right. And there's a real potential here, right, for aducanumab approval and prescribing to exacerbate existing disparities in Alzheimer's disease dementia care. And that we know that Blacks and African Americans are disproportionately affected by Alzheimer's disease. And one of the things that AGS encourages CMS to do is to monitor the disparities in uptake and use of aducanumab over time, and to provide supportive services to people who are living with Alzheimer's disease who are prescribed aducanumab. And they specifically, their language is that CMS must require longitudinal data collection in order to ensure that CMS understands how aducanumab is being prescribed and administered in the real world. Here's the title of our podcast, e.g. to understand who is getting the product. This is particularly important given lack of trial data from the following patient populations: underrepresented, disproportionately affected, and understudied populations, e.g. Black people living with Alzheimer's disease, and people living with Alzheimer's disease who are excluded from phase 3 clinical trials, including people over the age of 85, as we've discussed, patients with other concurrent or previous neurologic pathophysiology, and people who are on anticoagulation therapy. So I think, judging by the way things are going, my sense is CMS will probably approve it in some form, and it may be a limited form, as Tim was just talking about earlier. And that it is essential that we monitor, post-approval, who is getting the drug, what the impacts are, and hopefully what the outcomes are of prescribing aducanumab.
Yeah, and I think that the danger here is people are also using the diversity angle to try to get CMS to fully approve this drug. That it would worsen disparities in care if they don't get this covered because of the sheer cost. Like, who can afford not just $56,000 a year for the drug, but add on another $50,000 a year for MRIs and PET scans and everything else that you need to do to get this drug. So you run a risk of worsening disparities by not approving this drug. But with that said, it's a drug that if it works, it barely works. And there's a really good chance that it doesn't work at all. And if you look at the trials, so there's a really fabulous JAMA Neurology paper by Jennifer Manley and Maria Glymore that goes over the approval, what aducanumab's approval reveals about Alzheimer's disease research. And specifically, they talk about only 0.6% of the people in these trials, in the aducanumab trials, were identified as Black, 3% Hispanic, 0.03% as American Indian or Alaska Native, and 0.03% as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. Like, that is just, that's terrible. And I think the problem is that a lot of where these studies occur in memory centers in big places where a lot of the participants or a lot of the people who go there are white and wealthy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a challenge. I think this gets mentioned in Maria and Jennifer's article as well. But the NIH is able to say, we have certain requirements when it comes to recruitment by age and by diversity, and certainly they've made a stronger push to be inclusive. But the NIH is not who funds new drug trials generally. The NIH is funding, the initial thing that leads to the discovery of aducanumab in the first place. And so industry really gets to choose. And just like you said, they're choosing by convenience of who comes into memory centers. And if you haven't essentially fixed the health equity access question when it comes to who can access high quality neurologists, folks like Marco, then you haven't, been able to even start to recruit people to those trials. And I guess that becomes a bigger question that I'm not sure if the government can regulate how industry selects people, but I think that the attention to kind of the initial just access to care gets overlooked quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. And Marco, in Italy, I'm sure there are issues with, people living in very rural areas, not having access to specialized Alzheimer's disease centers where they have the capability to infuse and monitor people prescribed aducanumab.
Yeah, first of all, there is this issue of diversity also in Europe, and it is a multicultural population, and so there is the risk that, for example, international migrants or people composing ethnic minorities will be excluded from the access to these treatments. For example, most of the measures and tests that have been adopted in Emerge and Engage or have been developed in Western contexts, so they do not support a culture-sensitive cognitive assessment. So this may underestimate or overestimate the cognitive performance of patients. And of course, another risky implication of the approval of aducanumab is that will increase the inequalities in the access to diagnosis and treatment, because only the patients that have access to the highly specialized services that have frequent contacts with their GPs, at least in Italy, will have access to a biomarker-based diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, because, for example, in Italy, not all the dementia facilities have a PET scan available. And so this is, I think, one implication that I don't know, there is not debate on this. If aducanumab will be approved, and it's approved, but also in Europe, this will automatically translate into the clinical practice a biomarker-based diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And we should know, and we should remember that the clinical validation of these biomarkers is not completed. There is a real-world problem also in this area of research, because biomarkers should be validated in real-world population of patients, and there are very few data that confirm that the validity of these biomarkers, so their accuracy to distinguish between a D and non-AD dementias is high also in real-world population of patients. So, but the availability of a disease-modifying treatments, of course, will render this biological-based diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease immediately available, immediately valid, and this is dangerous, I think.
Yeah, so many things about that is dangerous, including the fact that we're now using a surrogate marker, which is amyloid in the brain, as the reason to approve a drug. Because FDA did not approve this based on the meaningful clinical findings of either Emerge or Engage. They based it on, hey, it reduces amyloid in the brain, so that's good enough for us to approve this drug through an accelerated pathway.
Yeah, great. Yeah, there is also a nice viewpoint on JAMA neurology, I think, by Vincent Planche from Bordeaux, on the use of surrogate endpoint and amyloid load as a surrogate endpoint. It is another methodological issue that should be addressed, because
Okay, Tim, question for you. zooming out beyond aducanumab. So this is not just a problem with aducanumab. This is a problem with every drug. And Marco does a good job of bringing that back in, is that this is a problem of not even NIH. This is drug company sponsored trials creating these inclusion and exclusion criteria to really enrich the base, but also for real scientific reasons. You don't want too much heterogeneity in your sample. Like if you're going to study a drug to reduce amyloid, people should probably have amyloid in their brain. How do we fix this moving forward? Do you have any ideas?
So I think that there is maybe a challenge between the need for explanatory trials, or those really, closely knit small population initial trials that may only have kind of these hyper selected populations, and then the need for what often gets called pragmatic or almost real world trials. And I think, unfortunately, the discourse of drug approval is we have to approve things as fast as possible. And so we get impatient. And initially we was sometimes doctors and patients, but now we seems to be the FDA as well, to not wait for those studies. I mean, I don't think it necessarily makes sense to have no exclusion criteria for every new drug that we have, but it does make sense to have staggered trials where you start in certain populations. If that's working well, then you expand out. But that's something that, you have to really think about, right? Like how we regulate drug approvals, and really say that either we're going to make a conscious decision that when we approve it, we're going to only go with studied groups. We're only going to go with studied groups and groups for which at least we're not likely to harm them. And then maybe that last bar is those high-risk people. I mean, I think weighing risk and benefits in unstudied groups is that important piece. The risk and benefit in an 86-year-old versus an 84-year-old is probably not that different. The risk and benefit in somebody on 2 anticoagulants versus somebody on nothing is probably quite a bit different. And so I wonder if there's a way to more develop that framework for doctors as well as the FDA to be able to kind of quickly synthesize who these trials apply to. Unfortunately, it feels like rarely is there kind of something we teach in medical education.
Yeah, I think potentially also thinking about a new standard for medical journals is that I don't think it's enough just to say I'm going to exclude these folks and here are my exclusions, but why? Why did you include these folks? Why did you exclude these conditions like anticoagulation? Why did you do that? Greater than 85. Why did you do that? Why does your sample include mostly just white people? Actually addressing those, it could be in the supplement, but somewhere for us to figure out, like,
Agreed.
What was the reason behind this exclusion?
Yeah, and also maybe a minimum core of information should be always provided in terms, for example, which is the proportion of patients that had diabetes, which is the main comorbidities, maybe in the supplementary material, of course, so that the clinician can somehow compare the population of the trial and the population that is encountering in the daily practice, so that you can, for example, how many drugs, the mean number of drugs that the patients enrolled in the trial were taking. So the number, not the category. So maybe for drugs, okay, so they can somehow try to understand their clinical complexity and compare with my population.
Yeah, maybe that should be in the FDA label or in the label in Italy, where you actually see, this is the population. This is the pie chart of what looks like for comorbidities in general. Mm-hmm. And this is the pie chart of what were included in this trial. Or this is the percent of people that would be included, 1% for Marco's trial, 10% for Tim's analysis. So you get a sense of, like, maybe this is not generalizable to the patients that I care for.
I mean, I don't see why these have to be separate studies that Marco and I do. Why can't it be baked into the FDA approval documents, as you said, or actually in that table 1 is just another column of this is the population of Alzheimer's in the countries that we did our trial in. Or something.
But wouldn't it be great to have a table 1, given that these studies are not even published yet?
Not published.
We've had 3 podcasts on the subject. There's been more editorials on aducanumab.
The more we podcast, the less likely they are to publish.
So stop podcast.
Well, I want to thank both Marco and Tim for joining us on this podcast. Before we end, Alex, do you want to give us a little bit more?
Yeah, because things are so bright and cheery.
Yeah.
And, I love. I think I'm starting to understand this song was selected with a bit of irony. I think I can make it now. The pain is gone. All of the bad feelings have disappeared. Here is that rainbow I've been praying for. It's gonna be a bright, 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 sunshiny day. It's gonna be a bright, 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 sunshiny day.
I feel like that's going to be the song at the Biogen Investor Conference.
Although in the news, right, Biogen's not doing so great. We have institutions like MGH and others who are not prescribing it. We'll see.
Yeah, I think the problem that we're going to see now is all of the other amyloid antibodies coming out. Like if they've approved Aduhelm, there's no reason not to improve all of these others that really have not shown to make a meaningful clinical difference, but they can reduce amyloid burden in the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't. It's a logical fallacy not to approve them.
It's all about the Benjamins.
It's all about the Benjamins. Tim,
Maybe I'll
Marco,
rap.
thank you
One
for
of these
joining
days
us.
I will rap.
I will wait for it. Every AGS, I'll look for it, Alex.
Thank you, Archstone Foundation, for continued support. And to all of our listeners, thank you for supporting the Jerry Powell podcast. Bye, everybody.